and welcome back to the show. Today we're talking with Chris Clearfield, one of the authors of Meltdown, Why Our Systems Fail and What We Can Do About It. Chris, in our first segment, you gave us a lot of good information about systems. I had one more question for you to continue on. What contributes to the continued complexity of our systems? Why do they get so complex?
Yeah, I think that there's sort of two ways of kind of framing an answer to that. One way is that they get more complex because we're adding more capabilities, right? We're adding safety systems. We're adding, the ability to do new things. We're innovating on how we, structure a network to deliver, products or processes quickly. And a lot of that has the sort of consequence of adding complexity to our systems, making the networks more interconnected and less linear. So that's half of the answer. But I think the other half of the answer is that engineers and the people that are embedded in these systems don't often think about complexity in an explicit enough way. And what I mean by that is there's really a cost of complexity, and we can really account for that cost by thinking about what the consequences are. But, manufacturers and business people, they will add features without regard to the cost of that complexity. So I mentioned cars before. I'll give you an example. I have a 2016 Subaru Outback, and I can look up stock prices on my dashboard. And I have no idea why anyone would want to do this. But it's a feature in the car. And it seems like a harmless feature, but you kind of realize that, well, it implies that there's a cellular connection embedded in that car. And again, that seems like just a capability, but what that's doing is taking this piece of very, already very complex hardware and networking it in the world. And we've actually seen examples of, and we write about this in the book, examples of hackers who, are able to remotely control a car through the cellular connection and muck with some of the core features like the transmission as the car is driving down the highway. Unfortunately, the hackers that did that were sort of, they were good guys. They were white hat hackers. But I think it just goes to, it's just an example of this idea that we don't build in complexity, whether that's in a piece of technology or in our business processes. We don't consider it an explicit variable kind of quite often enough.
Is that because we don't, should I say this, plan well, or we don't really investigate the repercussions of what we're doing? We'd rather put a fancy bell and whistle on something so that it looks good and we can sell it for more rather than understanding the consequences of what it might cause?
I don't want to paint too broad a brush. I mean, there are definitely people who do think very, very carefully about these issues. But I guess that this is such a feature of our modern society that to me, it feels like it's almost not enough anymore that some people think about it. I mean, I think it's got to be front and center for so much of our decision making these days.
Interesting. So my next question I was going to ask you is, because I thought this was rather interesting, I found it in your book here. Do we fail our systems or do our systems fail us? And I think you kind of touched on this a little bit with regards to some of the 3 Mile Island example and the Event Horizon example.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think the way I would put it is, I'm a big fan of the both and answer, right? The way I would put it is, we are often, in the way that our systems are designed, because of the complexity that we sometimes introduce at the design level, the engineering level, even the business level, we can end up with these systems where we end up expecting too much of the people who are embedded in it. So I think aviation is a great example, and right now what's top of my mind is the recent crashes of the Boeing 737 MAX. Which is an incredibly sophisticated airplane, and it's an airplane where to kind of develop it, and Boeing, had more efficient engines, which meant they had to make some design changes. And one of the ways they did that is by inputting this automatic system that, helped. It was a safety system. It was to help prevent the airplane from kind of flying outside of the design envelope, essentially. And so that sounds great, but when that system malfunctioned, as it's pretty clear that it did in the case of the the Lion Air crash that happened in October, when that system malfunctions, suddenly the flight crew, suddenly the pilots are put in a position where, they are startled, right? And they respond as imperfect humans sometimes do, by not being rational in the moment, by not doing the right thing. And that's a tough position to be in.
Is it, again, that kind of gets me thinking about that false sense of security, right? If pilots are all of a sudden, surprised that, hey, this isn't working all of a sudden, is that, would those same feelings happen today as they would on an airplane in the 60s? Would a pilot feel the same way?
It's a great question. I think that the answer is probably, I'm sure it happens sometimes in the 60s, but I think that the answer is the set of challenges in the 60s were kind of a different set of challenges. It was more like managing the communication between the flight crew and managing the workload, which is still very much top of mind. But I think that there were probably fewer instances of what we think of as pilots as the kind of what's called automation surprise, just the plane doing something. And this can happen from, small airplanes to the airliners that we fly in commercially. The plane doing something and the reaction of the pilots is, why is it doing that? And I think the less automation that there was in airplanes, the less likely that kind of surprise was to happen. So yeah, it's a good question.
So how do we improve that? If there's all these safety systems, and we'll stay with the example of an airplane for now. If we have all these safety systems and something goes wrong, is there some sort of a skill we need to, or some sort of scenario-based testing that we should go through, for pilots to say, even though you have this, no matter how remote, here is, a potential situation.
Well, yeah, let me frame that kind of question more broadly, because I think, we've been talking all about failure, but most of the book is actually about how to manage complexity, how to reduce it, and how teams can work better with it. And I think with aviation, it's important to note that, aviation is far and away the safest form of transportation that humans have ever designed. It's kind of unthinkably safe to the point where, it's by far the least safe part of any trip is the drive to the airport, right? Just kind of from a statistical perspective. So in aviation, we already do a great job of getting crews to kind of work together and be good at this, despite these sort of anomalous crashes that we see. And I actually think that's kind of a nice way of jumping off. We know that manufacturers, the story we were just talking about, kind of is sort of stands out because it's anomalous in some sense. That manufacturers think very carefully about how to keep complexity in the cockpit down to a minimum, how to keep the flight crew in the loop so they know what's going on. But the other thing that's really interesting that I think is a real lesson from aviation to the rest of business is really the two things. One is getting people to speak up about their concerns. That is a tremendously valuable way of creating safety in complex systems. If people feel comfortable saying, hey, I don't understand this, or hey, this seems like a problem to me, then you'll be in a situation where there might be a small error that starts to bubble up, but then somebody points it out. And even just that pointing it out means that teams are more likely to come together to fix it. So that's one, I think, real strong lesson. Aviation went through this transformation in the 70s and 80s where they went from, this model where the captain is king and his word, and it was mostly a him, his word is law, to this model where it's a very collaborative environment. And I think we need to see more of that kind of safety and willingness to speak up in all of our businesses.
That's a little bit of a change in corporate culture. Sorry, that's a little bit of change in corporate culture for many places, wouldn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And it's easy to say, it's easy to talk about. It's very hard to do. A friend of ours who's a 737 captain and an accident investigator, the way he puts it is, he says, if you shoot the messenger, then nobody's gonna tell you what's wrong in the system anymore. And And that's a really dangerous position to be in. And I think that's what we see in the aftermath of some of these accidents. And it is a big change in corporate culture. It's a simple change, but that doesn't mean that it's an easy change.
That's right. So I had to get that point in there because there's a lot of talk, about executives and corporate culture and trying to get this disaster mindset, with executives. So I had to jump in there while it was on my mind.
No, I think it's a perfect point. I think it's very well spotted, very well said.
So the first point is getting people to speak up. And so what was the second point that you wanted to bring forward?
The second point, I think that where we really see a strong example from aviation, which has done this incredibly successfully, is creating a learning environment, creating a whole industry that is really geared towards learning, creating airlines and pilots and manufacturers and even regulators who, generally speaking, work together in this collaborative way to understand small errors before they become big ones, and to fix those problems before they spiral out of control. And I think that's really something, that's really a lesson that we can learn from our in our companies too. And we work with some companies that come to us because they want to learn better from the errors that they have. Sometimes these are kind of business questions, but sometimes they are, technology questions. A firm who, is a technology company who knows that they have a process, say, to talk about what happens when their web server goes down or when somebody pushes out a piece of buggy code. But they know that process could be improved and they could really get kind of a higher return on investment from these kind of engineering postmortems, if you will. And that's a great thing to sort of think about, that, in a complex system, you can't ahead of time talk about all the ways the system might fail. So one of the things we can do is we can learn from the small ways that the system is telling us that it can fail.
Do you have any recommendations how to really utilize like lessons learned? Because I'm sure you've seen it, in what you do. People say, yeah, we've got this lesson learned process or system, in place, and the next program or project comes along and they experience the exact same thing. So do you have any recommendations how to really utilize lessons learned?
Yes. I'm glad you asked. There are ways to do it. And one of the ways to do it is to do the loop, like if you can think about it as a learning loop, to sort of do two things. One is to don't leave the loop till the end, right? Have the loop be sort of event driven. So, if you misinterpreted something that somebody said, well, then, kind of address that right away rather than letting the whole project continue with that sort of in the air, until the end. I guess another way to put it is, one of the things that we learned about in the book is how, when we were doing the research, is how effective teams kind of manage crises. And they sort of go through this loop of, coming up with a guess of what the problem is, trying a solution, and then seeing if that solution works, and then refining their guess of what the problem is. And you can see that it's a loop. So it sort of, it could start with just trying something and then seeing what happens and then refining your guess of what the problem is. And that way of iterating, I think one of the challenges of the kind of big, project after action is that it's just too infrequent, right? So you can't really incorporate the learning. And then by the time you get to a similar project that is like that, everybody's kind of forgotten about what happened in the first round. So that's one way, I think, to think about it. Have this not be a postmortem that happens at the end of a project, but have it be kind of a weekly, or and even a daily, what worked well, what didn't work well, what are we going to try next time? But that again, back to your earlier point, that really requires that culture that supports that. People have to be able to raise their hand and say, hey, I messed this up.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've worked on projects and programs, I'm sure, as well. And by the time you get to the end of the lessons learned, half the team is gone. and your memory of a potential really good lesson learned that you can utilize and implement has been forgotten or completely misinterpreted, months or a year down the road.
Totally. Yeah. No, I think that's a great way of putting it. So, that's the other thing to think about too. Is sort of enshrining these lessons through stories, right? So humans learn very, very powerfully from stories, and we learn very, very powerfully from analogies. So if you can make this kind of storytelling a central part of your culture, then you actually can do a much better job of sort of tying in what your challenges are with the kind of learning that people can actually do. So I think that's a really a kind of positive way to sort of think about it too.
That's interesting. You mentioned storytelling and analogies. Would you use that to help strengthen our systems? Not just from lessons learned,
totally,
but could you
right?
use that?
Yeah, and I think one of the ways that we use that is the other part of the learning loop, which is paying attention to these small issues before they become big ones. And this researchers call this anomalizing. And I think it's a really interesting way to think about the world. It's basically treating these small errors as if they are an important part of your system rather than a side effect you can ignore. And one of the ways that I think these two concepts tie together is that, there are so many, you don't just have to learn from your own failures. You can also learn from the stories of other people's failures, right? And I think in some ways that's almost easier, because if you're sort of outside of an industry, if you're outside of the context of an operation, you can sort of start to see some of the simplifying assumptions that got built into the way that people approach things. And so that can be a powerful way to learn from other people's stories, is almost one way to say it.
Yeah, read the headlines, find out what they're doing, the conferences, there's all kinds of ways, to learn that. I think that's a really good point. So we've come to the end of our second segment. We are talking with the co-author, Chris Clearfield of Meltdown, Why Our Systems Fail and What We Can Do About It. We'll be right back. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.